Chapter 19 is infectious diseases affecting the nervous system. We're only going to cover one, and that is bacterial meningitis. So the central nervous system, or CNS, is the dense tissues of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system are the nerves that extend to the extremities. And the CNS is encased in bony protections of the spinal cord, which is a series of vertebrae that are stacked on top of one another with the spinal cord running in between them. And the brain is encased in the skull. The neurons are the cells that make up the brain and spinal cord of the CNS, and the meninges are membranes that surround the neurons. So meningitis is inflammation of the meninges. In this detailed figure of the central nervous system, we have the meninges divided up into their three layers. So the three layers that make up the meninges are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the subarachnoid space. The dura mater is the most superficial and is lying just below the bony casing of the skull or the spinal cord. Below the dura mater is the arachnoid mater, and in between the arachnoid mater and the tissues of the brain is the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which is often abbreviated CSF. And the cerebrospinal fluid is important for two reasons. It provides nutrients to the central nervous system tissues, and it also provides a cushion to shield the delicate tissues of the brain and spinal cord. The defenses of the nervous system are the bony structures that I mentioned, so we have the spinal cord and the skull. The blood-brain barrier, which is the idea that the vessels supplying the central nervous system with blood have a very limited permeability. So vessels in the rest of the body will allow sugars and drugs and ions to cross pretty easily. But in the central nervous system, the blood vessels are surrounded by cells that are very discerning and will not let many chemicals or molecules cross. And this is meant to protect the very sensitive brain and spinal cord. It represents a challenge for treating diseases of the nervous system because you have a difficult time delivering drugs to these areas because of this blood-brain barrier. We also have microglial cells which have phagocytic activity, but they are not as active as phagocytes we see in other parts of the body. Similarly, macrophages have phagocytic activity, but again are not as active as phagocytes in other areas. So within the nervous system, in addition to the bony casings, the blood-brain barrier, and the presence of some low-activity phagocytes like microglial cells and macrophages, the central nervous system also has something called immunological privilege, which means that the immune response of an invading pathogen in the central nervous system is going to be much more dampened and not as aggressive as the immune response to a pathogen in another part of the body. The reason for this is that immune response often brings inflammation and increased fluid volume in order to recruit cells to the area where the pathogen has invaded. Increased volume or fluid in the central nervous system will cause damage to those tissues because there's no room for extra volume without putting a lot of pressure on the brain or the spinal cord. So in the central nervous system, there's a very limited presence of immune cells. There's less expression of MHC molecules, which means less antigen presentation to T cells. There's also less circulating complement proteins, so we have less response from the innate immune system. And then in addition, there's no protection from normal biota. So these are areas of the body where we do not see microbes growing in a healthy individual. So for all these reasons, the central nervous system is a very vulnerable system, and when infection does occur there, it can be very dangerous. So we're going to discuss bacterial meningitis, which is caused by the gram-negative bacteria Neisseria meningitidis. Meningitis can be caused by viruses or other microbes, but the most common cause of meningitis is this gram-negative bacteria. It is a diplococcus, so it's rounded in shape and associates in pairs of 2 cells. It is also called meningococcus, and it causes 25% of all meningitis cases, the other 75% being caused by viruses, fungi, other microbes, or even non-microbial causes of inflammation in the meninges. With bacterial meningitis, there's a 15% mortality rate. The presence of Neisseria meningitidis can be normal or asymptomatic in 10% of adults, and the highest carriage rate of this bacteria is seen in young adults. Because Neisseria meningitidis does not survive in the environment for very long, its transmission is through respiratory droplets or by direct contact with secretions. Its virulence factors include a capsule, making it difficult for phagocytes to adhere to. It also produces an endotoxin, which is a part of the gram-negative cell envelope called the LPS portion of the cell envelope. So when the Neisseria meningitidis is killed, the endotoxin is released, and this causes a very severe immune reaction in the host, which is usually systemic and can be very damaging to the central nervous system tissues. Neisseria meningitidis also produces IgA protease, which you may remember IgA is the immunoglobulin A antibody that is released in mucus secretions of the respiratory tract. And because Neisseria meningitidis is commonly transmitted by respiratory droplets, its portal of entry is the upper respiratory system. So IgA protease helps it destroy the IgA released in the upper respiratory tract and survive in these tissues in order to infect the host. So the tissues infected are often initially the upper respiratory tract, where it destroys IgA and is able to adhere to epithelial cells lining this system, and then it can migrate from there into the meninges. So the signs and symptoms of bacterial meningitis, which is similar for all types of meningitis, are photophobia, which means sensitivity to light, headache, which is described by individuals that have had meningitis as the worst headache they've ever had, painful stiff neck, fever, and then increased white blood cell count in the cerebrospinal fluid. So diagnosing meningitis is important to do very quickly because the disease can be fatal and it progresses very fast. So usually if a person has symptoms of meningitis, you will start treatment immediately, and you will then do testing to confirm or eliminate the possibility that they actually do have meningitis. So what you would do is take a sample of cerebrospinal fluid, blood, or snot, and you would stain it with a gram stain and look for gram-negative diplococci. You could also culture the sample in order to confirm the presence of Neisseria. There are rapid tests which can be done to detect the presence of capsular antigens that are present on Neisseria meningitidis. And then Neisseria meningitidis is a gram-negative which produces oxidase, an enzyme important for making reactive oxygen species less damaging. So Neisseria produces oxidase. If you have an oxidase positive microbe, then that can be evidence that you're dealing with Neisseria meningitidis. The prevention for bacterial meningitis is immunization, which is recommended at age 11. And this is a conjugated vaccine that handles most of the strains of Neisseria meningitidis. There is a booster required later in order to provide protection through adolescence. And at the time when the booster is given for the MC4 vaccine, it's recommended that a second vaccine is given for the one type of Neisseria that is not covered by MCV4. Additionally, you would do broad spectrum antibiotics for anyone having symptoms of Neisseria or if anyone's been exposed in order to just reduce the risk of having that microbe in the central nervous system. And then if you confirm the person has meningitis, you would continue with antibiotics. If they end up not having, you would discontinue use. So the portal of entry for Neisseria meningititis is often the upper respiratory tract through respiratory droplet particles. Once it's in the upper respiratory tract, it's in very close vicinity to blood vessels supplying the central nervous system, so it can easily move from the upper respiratory tract to the blood vessels, and in this way it gets into the central nervous system. So 10% of people carry Neisseria in their upper respiratory tract without any problem, but in immune-compromised individuals, this Neisseria can sometimes spread and get into the central nervous system. On the left, we have Neisseria growing on an agar plate, and you overlay the growth with a chemical that will turn brown if the microbe produces oxidase. So all of these dark brown or black colonies are positive for oxidase, and this is the case with Neisseria. You can also do a gram stain where you would look for a gram-negative Diplococcus, which is indicated with the arrows in this gram stain picture.